Chapter 23, When I Come Around.
No time to search the world around, 'cause you know where I'll be found.
Izuku awoke to something tugging gently at his hair. Muttering nonsense to himself, he buried his face deeper into his pillow. The tugging persisted. He batted half-heartedly at his head, earning him an irritated mew. He frowned and opened his eyes. It took him a moment to reorient himself. He was still wearing his clothes from the previous day, leaving him uncomfortable and sweaty. The bed that he was lying on was firm and slightly rumpled, apparently unslept in. Something warm was wedged between the bed and the crook of his neck. When his mind groggily pieced together the events from the night before, he flushed and glanced at the person lying across the bed from him. Katsuki was asleep on his back, his mouth slightly open and his arm pinned between Izuku's head and shoulders. He had no idea when they'd actually fallen asleep, he only knew that it had been late. He watched Katsuki's chest slowly rise and fall. He looked surprisingly peaceful, with no trace of a frown on his face. Another tug reminded Izuku of the reason he'd woken up. He groaned and rolled towards the source of the tugging. Missy hissed and bounded over him, shooting him what looked an awful lot like a glare, then settled into a ball at Katsuki's side. Snickering quietly, Izuku felt around on the bed until his hand came into contact with his phone. He checked the time on the nearly dead device and sighed. He was technically supposed to have been at the office 5 minutes ago, but he couldn't bring himself to care much. He slowly pushed himself into an upright position. "Hey!" Izuku turned his head. Katsuki was looking at him groggily. "Hey," he replied uncertainly. He held his breath, waiting to see what Katsuki would do. Katsuki yawned and scratched his neck. "Sleep okay," he mumbled. Izuku relaxed. A small smile threatened to form. "Well enough," he said. "You." Katsuki grumbled something unintelligible, then slowly rolled himself into a sitting position. Missy yowled and leapt to the floor. She dashed out of the room, abandoning them entirely. He raised his arms and stretched, cracking his back. "Do you need towels or breakfast or anything?" Izuku shook his head slowly. It was going to take him some time to get used to this new Katsuki. "I think I'm just going to head to work," he said. He didn't really feel like freshening up only to walk in and be fired. "Rip the band-aid off, you know." He got to his feet and stretched, rearranging his wrinkled clothes. "Right," Katsuki said. "So, we should do this again sometime." Izuku started. He hadn't been expecting that and he couldn't deny that it felt really good to hear. However, he glanced over his shoulder at Katsuki. Katsuki met his gaze uncertainly. "What?" he asked. "Was it bad?" He pressed his lips together, suppressing a smile. There was something about the earnest way that Katsuki was looking at him that he found incredibly endearing. "No, Ka-chan," he said, sitting back down. Katsuki joined him at the edge of the bed. Izuku fiddled with his hands, trying to figure out what he wanted to say. "I think," he trailed off. "If we were going to do this, I think we should set some ground rules first." Katsuki frowned. "Okay," he said slowly. "Like what?" Izuku paused. "Well, for starters, I'm not okay with you constantly freezing me out. I'm not going to chase after you anymore." He sighed. "We don't have to talk all the time, but if you're busy or need space, then tell me. I can give you space. But don't ignore me." Katsuki remained silent for a moment, then nodded once. "That's fair." Also, he chewed on his lip, deliberating how he wanted to approach the next topic. "I think that it would be better if you took the lead. I mean, when it comes to anything physical." He reddened. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable and I don't want to feel like ish for going too far. So here's my suggestion. I won't try for anything beyond what happened last night, but if you ever want more than that, then you have to initiate it." Katsuki looked away from Izuku, his gaze fixated on the floor. "You're really okay with that?" Izuku nodded. "Yeah," he said. "I don't want that kind of pressure between us." Katsuki's stormy expression cleared. "Okay," he said. "Then, we can go on a second date." Izuku smiled despite himself. "Yeah. He reached over and squeezed Katsuki's hand. I have to get going though. I overslept. He released Katsuki's hand and stood up. After splashing cold water on his face in the bathroom and attempting to correct the horrific wet tangle that Missy had chewed into his hair, he headed for the front door. Katsuki was in the kitchen, heating up a frying pan on the stove. You sure you don't want breakfast? He asked while Izuku tugged his shoes on. Nah, he said. His phone was starting to vibrate and he wasn't eager to find out what he was missing. I don't want to be too late. Katsuki nodded. He turned away from the stove and rummaged around in the cupboards, shoving a fistful of protein bars at him. Here. Izuku laughed. Thanks, he said, pocketing them. He tilted his head. I'll talk to you later. Yeah. Katsuki hesitated, then approached him. He squinted like he was sizing him up, then in one swift motion, leaned in and kissed him. Let me know how things go, he said. Izuku couldn't hide his grin or ignore the fluttering in his chest. Yeah, he said. I will. Izuku scooted into work only 45 minutes late thanks to Katsuki's apartment being nearby. Sneaking over to his workstation, he fumbled around in his drawer for a spare charger. He'd barely plugged his phone in when a presence loomed over him. Morning, Mirio said cheerfully. He plopped himself on the edge of Izuku's desk. Sleep in. Izuku half-heartedly searched for an excuse. Traffic was bad. Mirio looked over Izuku's rumpled form, his eyes dancing playfully. Of course. That darn city traffic. He grinned. Wink. Izuku snorted. He wasn't sure whether it was worth defending himself at this point. Have you heard anything? Sure have. That's why I came to find you. Mirio's grin didn't fade in the slightest. Apparently they've been trying to contact you. They asked me to bring you upstairs as soon as you came in. They want to see both of us. He laughed. Maybe we're both about be fired. That'd be a pickle, wouldn't it? Izuku's heart sank. If he was going to crash and burn, he wanted to do it alone. The last thing he wanted was to drag Mirio down with him. Togata, he shook his head. I'll take full responsibility for everything. There's no way I'd let them do that to you. Mirio laughed even louder. Relax, he said, slapping Izuku's back. It was a joke. Besides, that's not the impression that I get. He rose to his feet. Shall we? Izuku breathed a sigh of relief. That was a terrible joke, he chided lightly as he stood. Was it? Mirio replied playfully. My apologies. He followed Mirio to the back of the studio, up the elevator, and through the familiar offices. Mirio greeted everyone they passed with enthusiasm, earning them a multitude of glances. Izuku caught Ochiko's eye when she poked her head up over the top of her cubicle. He gave her a half-wave and she smiled and waved in return. When they reached the editor-in-chief's office, Mirio knocked politely. You opened the door seconds later. There he is, she exclaimed with a concerning amount of enthusiasm. Izuku couldn't read her true feelings behind the false smile plastered on her face. Mirio strode in confidently with Izuku in tow. You closed the door behind them and took a seat opposite Nemuri's desk, crossing one leg over the other. Mirio leaned against the wall with a casualness that Izuku couldn't comprehend. Nemuri's mouth curved wickedly as she looked him up and down. Midoriya Izuku, she said. You are full of surprises. She gestured at the empty chair next to you. Am I, he stammered, cautiously taking a seat. Nemuri chortled. Modest, too. How charming. She glanced at you. I suppose I have to commend you for having the foresight to pull this off. I'm not sure I would have approved of a gamble on a cover shoot, but what can I say? When we get results, we get results. You puffed her chest, lazily tossing her hair over her shoulder. That's what us artists do, I suppose, she drawled. Her gaze flitted over to Izuku as if daring him to disagree. I was right to take a chance on Midoriya. Izuku might have been outraged if something more pressing wasn't fighting for his attention. Does that mean you liked the photos? He asked. Namuri and Yu exchanged glances and laughed simultaneously, unnerving Izuku thoroughly. Once they finally stopped, Namuri released a long sigh. Yes, she said. We liked the photographs very much. You executed Yu's vision well. She looked at Yu with a strange fondness in her eyes. It was a stroke of brilliance for her to think of using your experience in concert photography to our advantage. Izuku's jaw dropped. Mirio coughed loudly into his fist. You gave Izuku the death glare of the century. This all went apparently unnoticed by Namuri. She stood up from her chair and splayed her hands out on top of her glossy desk. This is exactly the kind of energy that the beat needs, she declared. Fresh. Youthful. Vibrant. I want more of this going forward from everyone. She swiveled her computer monitor around so that it was facing them. On the screen was Ground Zero, sweaty and shirtless and snarling with the electric guitar from the chute gripped roughly between his hands. Now this is a cover shot, she said. I want this feature out next month. We'll shuffle things around to make it happen. We need to publish while the band is still hot. Does anyone foresee any problems in accomplishing this? Mirio piped up. They'll need extra time in post-production. Aside from that, I don't see there being an issue. When will you need the finals by? Next Wednesday at the latest, Namuri replied. Preferably sooner. We'll get the photo selections to you by end of day. Mirio winced. It'll be tight, but with Midoriya's help, I think we can manage. He looked at Izuku. What do you think? Ah. Yeah, Izuku replied, trying to keep up with the fast-paced conversation. We'll get it done. Namuri beamed. That's what I like to hear. That leaves one last thing. She sat down and thumbed through some papers on her desk. We can't credit a cover shoot to a junior fashion photographer. That would be ridiculous. How about assistant to the deputy director of photography? Izuku's brain short-circuited. He'd been prepared to walk into the office today and walk out a short while later without a job. With that title, he'd be working directly under Mirio. Wah! Really? Namuri smirked. Unless Togata has an issue with it. Mirio laughed and folded his arms. Not at all, he said. I'd be glad to have Midoriya as my assistant. He's a talented photographer. Izuku teared up, touched by his words. He still wasn't sure whether the beat was where he wanted to be long-term, but being acknowledged by his company felt amazing. Then I accept, he said, offering Mirio a wobbly grin. Excellent, Namuri said. She passed the papers over to you. I'll let you hammer out the details later. In the meantime, you two are dismissed. We have some photos to select. Izuku stood, bowing deeply. Thank you, Ms. Kayama. Namuri inclined her head graciously. You're welcome, but you should be thanking you. Seeing as the whole thing was her idea. Izuku turned towards his boss, who regarded him smugly. Letting you take credit for his concept didn't sit right with him. He could already imagine Katsuki giving him hell for it. He gritted his teeth and bowed again. Thank you, Ms. Takeyama, he said, as clearly and assertively as he could muster. I'm happy that you allowed me to pursue my idea for the shoot. He left the office with his head held high and a self-satisfied smirk on his face. You know she's never going to forgive you for that, Mirio said, still chortling to himself. That's okay, Izuku said. He felt oddly giddy. What's she going to do, fire me? Mirio laughed. You've got a real fire in you. He grinned. Yeah. I've been told that. When he returned to his workstation, he sent Katsuki a quick message. Guess who just got a promotion? Katsuki's reply was immediate. Nice. Make sure they give you a big fat raise to go with it. Falling asleep proved difficult that night. The day had been eventful even after Izuku's unexpected promotion. Between negotiating a salary increase and planning out the remainder of the week with Mirio, he was exhausted. He'd called his mother when he'd gotten home and then, after a moment's hesitation, he'd texted Katsuki as well. He'd informed him that he should have asked for more money and then proceeded to invite him over for celebratory drinks the next day. Izuku checked his phone for the umpteenth time, 2:43 a.m. He opened the Outreach News website and refreshed the page once, then twice, then 3 times. Nothing yet. He groaned. Outreach News had told him that his project would be posted that day. Realistically, he knew that it wouldn't be published in the dead of night, but the waiting was killing him. His stomach had been in knots ever since the clock had struck midnight. He refreshed the app a few more times, then forced himself to put his phone down. Work was going to be really busy for the next week or so, he should try to rest at least. Izuku spent the next several hours tossing and turning before finally managing to fall asleep. When his alarm went off, he jolted upright so hard that he tumbled out of bed. With his back on the floor and his legs tangled up in his bed sheets, Izuku checked the website. His heart leapt to his throat. There it was, under the features section. They'd tweaked the title, but he recognized it instantly by the accompanying photograph. With trembling fingers, he tapped the link and scrolled through his project. The written piece had definitely gone through additional edits, but his photographs were all there, front and center. His headshot was included at the end, along with a brief biography and his social media links. He checked the timestamp. It looked like it had recently been posted. He'd have to wait and see how it fared during the day. That didn't stop him, however, from sharing the link with his mother, Shoto, Itza, and Katsuki, as well as linking the article on every social media app that he used. Extricating himself from his bed sheets, Izuku hopped from foot to foot in the middle of his apartment. It couldn't be helped, he had to tell someone. He dashed out of the apartment and down the hallway, still in his pajamas. Vibrating with excitement, he knocked on Shoto's front door louder than he probably should have. He heard shuffling movements followed by the sound of a lock slowly being turned. Shoto opened the door, half-dressed and hair mussed. "Midoriya. Did you get my message?" Izuku blurted, shoving his phone in his friend's face. "It's up. It's up." Shoto took the phone from him. He squinted at the screen while Izuku paced back and forth. "I've been up all night waiting for it to be posted. Am I dreaming? I feel like I'm dreaming." "You're not dreaming," Shoto affirmed, returning the phone. "It looks great." Izuku couldn't suppress his excited screech. He flung himself at his friend, hugging him tightly. "Thank you," he said. "I couldn't have done this without you." "Ugh," Shoto said. "Thank my father. And tell him to stop messaging me while you're at it." He stepped back. "I mean it, Todoroki. You really helped me a lot." He checked the time. He was going to have to leave for work soon. "Sorry for coming by so early. I had to tell someone before I exploded." Shoto nodded, impassive as always. "I'm glad you're happy. I'll let you know if anything comes of it," Izuku said as his phone vibrated. "Thanks again." He rushed back to his apartment. His accounts had received a handful of new followers. His mother had seen the article. Izuku spent another couple of minutes glued to his phone before he managed to pry himself away from it long enough to take the world's fastest shower and get dressed for work. On the bus, notifications continued to trickle in. Izuku supposed he ought to feel tired, but he only felt exhilarated. Several of his new followers were names he recognized, local photographers and employees of Outreach News. His friends and contacts were starting to find it. Katsuki messaged him. "Read your story." Twice. "God damn, Deku." Izuku grinned. "You liked it? You effing killed it." A moment later. "So what's the game plan? They going to offer you more work?" "We'll see. I'm crossing my fingers. They'd be stupid not to." Izuku's face was starting to hurt. "I'll let you know if anything happens when I swing by later." "Sounds good." A short while later, Izuku stepped off the bus. It felt strange but, at the same time, familiar to be messaging Katsuki again. It was something that they'd done dozens of times before, but now, for some reason, it felt different. Maybe it was because he was no longer questioning his motives. Maybe it was because Katsuki had finally figured some things out. When he got into the beat, he headed straight for Mirio's office. He'd set up a small workstation in the corner the day before so that they could work on edits more efficiently. The office was dark, it looked like Mirio hadn't arrived yet. Sitting down, he began to catch up on emails. 5 minutes later, Mirio walked in. "Midoriya," he chirped. He seemed jollier than usual. "I saw your feature. Great stuff. I think I understand you as a photographer now." Izuku beamed. "Thanks. I worked really hard on it." He watched Mirio hum as he set his coffee down. Suddenly he remembered. "How was your date?" He grinned. "It was interesting. I actually wasn't sure whether he liked me much at first. He's very quiet. You really saved me with your advice. Indoor skydiving would have been a disaster." He chuckled. "I must have done all right in the end, because he invited me back to his place." "Oh." Izuku's lips twitched. Mirio waggled his eyebrows. "It was nothing untoward, if that's what you're thinking. He simply wanted to show me his solarium. He's quite the botanist." He laughed. "I'm glad it went well." "Yes." He agreed to a second date, so I'd say things are off to a good start. Izuku's pocket began to vibrate non-stop, earning a raised eyebrow from Mirio. "Is everything all right?" "Yeah," Izuku replied, pulling out his phone. He looked at his notifications. More followers, a couple of direct messages. "I think people are starting to see my project. Maybe I should turn off my alerts." "Good thinking. Ms. Takeyama will be coming and going today. I'm not sure whether publishing elsewhere would be considered a conflict of interest, so you might not want to make a show of it." "Noted," Izuku said. He put his phone on silent mode. Staying off of it was going to be one hell of a feat. His fingers were already twitching. They spent the morning reviewing the photo selections as well as Nemuri and use notes, then began to divide and conquer. Between the threat of use watchful eye and the admittedly exciting task of editing his first feature for the Beat, Izuku managed to stay mostly on task. By the time that lunch rolled around, however, he was going crazy. Retreating to the staff bathroom for a moment's privacy, he locked himself into a stall and checked his notifications. When he saw everything that he'd missed, he almost dropped his phone in the toilet. There were far too many notifications to count. Messages from friends and acquaintances. Comments on his posts. Several hundred new followers across his social media platforms. A dozen private messages. He brought up the Outreach News website. Dozens of people had left comments under his article. He sat down on the toilet and began to scroll through them. Some were complimentary while others were critical, but more interesting than that was the discussions taking place. Readers were talking about the issues that he'd brought up. Some were asking for updates on Monoma and AI and whether there was anything they could do to help them. Izuku buried himself deeper in the comments section. It was the first time he'd felt his work make an impact. He'd created something with a point, and people were paying attention. Not everyone was agreeing with him, sure, but plenty did, and others seemed to be thinking more deeply about topics that they hadn't considered previously. He'd used his art for something good, something that he believed in. It made his heart swell with pride and tears spring to his eyes. He scanned his new followers and followed a few names that he immediately recognized back. He almost dropped his phone again when he saw the managing editor of Outreach News among them. He'd have to take a closer look at everyone when he had more time. His private messages were overwhelmingly positive. Izuku was only able to spare them a quick glance, but apart from a disconcertingly aggressive messages from a total stranger, they seemed to be either congratulatory, curious about his work, or scouting him. He really started to cry then. Blinking tears from his eyes, he looked at his remaining message. "Do you have a contact for I? I have a job she might be interested in." Izuku frowned. He'd given I one of his business cards, but she'd never reached out to him. He wasn't sure if she'd even kept it. He wondered if he'd be able to find her again. He hoped for her sake that she wasn't still living on the streets, but the least he could do was try and locate her. His project's success was partially due to her contributions after all. Izuku's eyes wandered to the upper right-hand corner of the screen. He yelped and leapt to his feet when he noticed the time, only to be hit with a sudden wave of vertigo. He swooned and pressed his hand against the side of the stall, taking a couple of deep breaths. Once the dizziness subsided, he blinked a few times. Flashes of light flickered in front of his eyes. He groaned, today was not a good day for a migraine. He had a busy afternoon ahead of him, his lunch break was almost up, and he hadn't even eaten yet. Izuku shoved his phone into his pocket. Exiting the bathroom, he made his way over to his permanent workstation where he had a bottle of painkillers stashed. Praying that they would be enough, he popped 2 pills then headed out to a local cafe. He barely had enough time to buy a sandwich and scarf it down on the way back. Forcing himself through the afternoon proved to be an insurmountable feat. The painkillers had helped somewhat with the developing pain, but did nothing for the rest of his symptoms. His vertigo returned and his computer screen became increasingly difficult to look at. Izuku pressed his fingers into his eyes, his rapidly inhaled lunch sitting like a rock in his stomach. Mirio glanced at him from around the edge of his computer screen. "You alright, Midoriya?" "Ugh," Izuku said. "I've been battling a migraine since noon. I took some painkillers, but they're not helping much." He raised his head and looked at Mirio apologetically. "I'm sorry, Togata. I know we're busy, but do you mind if I leave a little early? I'll stay late tomorrow to make up for it." Mirio waved his hand. "Don't worry. I have a feeling we'll both be working late next week. It'd be better for you to rest now so that you're ready for the big deadline crunch." Izuku nodded gratefully. "Thank you. I'll make sure I'm prepared." Gathering his things sluggishly, he bid Mirio farewell. He trudged out of the office, his brain feeling like soup. He kept his eyes shut for most of the journey home, leaning forward in his seat and willing himself not to vomit. As his stop neared, he remembered that he was supposed to pop by Katsuki's after work. He swore as he pulled his phone from his pocket, typing out a brief message. "Hey, Ka-chan. I have to reschedule. Migraine. Sorry." He didn't look at his phone after that. Tripping off the bus stop, he made it up the elevator and into his apartment. He fumbled around for his migraine medication and swallowed it dry. With an unhappy groan, he collapsed onto his bed and pulled a pillow over his face, shutting out the world. Izuku was drifting in and out of consciousness when he heard a knock at the door. He groggily sat up, blinking slowly. The apartment was growing dark, he must have been out for a while. The pain had largely subsided. He dragged himself out of bed, padded to the door, and opened it. It took him a moment to register the person standing there. "Ah! Ka-chan," he said, squinting at the hallway's fluorescent lighting. "Sorry about cancelling." Katsuki shifted from one foot to the other. "It's fine," he said tersely. He was holding a heavy-looking plastic bag. "I brought you dinner." He glared at the floor. "Did I wake you up?" "Not really." The contents of the bag smelled good, but Izuku wasn't sure his stomach could handle food yet. He offered Katsuki a dopey smile. "Thanks. You didn't have to do that. I'll eat it later." He swayed slightly. Katsuki frowned at him. "You good?" Izuku nodded sloppily. He felt like a bobblehead. "I will be. The meds my neurologist prescribed me usually mess me up a bit." Katsuki's frown deepened. "Go lie down," he commanded. "I'll put the food away." He nodded, too out of it to argue. He stumbled back to his bed and sat down. Katsuki shut the door behind him, then went to the fridge and set the bag inside. It was dark in the apartment, but he seemed to understand that the lights should be left off. "You're not hungry?" Izuku shook his head. "I'm a little nauseous." "What time is it?" Katsuki glanced at his phone. "Almost 9. Damn. He must have been really out of it." He reached across his bed and picked up his phone. "I have a lot of catching up to do," he muttered. He unlocked it, wincing at the light that poured out of the device. Katsuki crossed the studio apartment in a few easy strides and took the phone out of Izuku's hand. "Leave it," he said, setting it on the bedside table. Izuku made a protesting noise. He'd left his phone on silent mode for most of the day and had barely looked at it since lunch. Do you have any idea how hard that is when my phone was going nuts with notifications all morning? The messages, Ka-chan. I've gotten so many new followers. I noticed, he replied. It was hard to read his face in the dimness of the room. The light's bugging you though, right? Leave it for now. You can catch up in the morning. He studied Izuku for a moment. You need anything? He asked gruffly. Water? Tea? Izuku pouted but didn't argue. Tea did sound nice. Maybe it would help settle his stomach. Maybe tea. Don't worry, I can make it. Like hell, Katsuki retorted. You look half drunk. You'd probably burn yourself. I'll do it. He watched, vaguely amused, while Katsuki puttered around his tiny kitchen, cursing under his breath. It had been ages since he'd been over to his place. He chuckled. What? Katsuki asked, glancing over his shoulder. Izuku grinned. I've had a nice day. Katsuki stared at him. You've had a nice day, he repeated. You're drugged to the uffing gills on migraine meds and you've had a nice day. He nodded. Yeah. Things are looking up. His expression softened. Thanks for coming to check on me, Ka-chan. Shut up. Katsuki returned to his task. I was already planning on cooking. It would have been stupid not to bring it over. He finished steeping the tea and brought it to Izuku, who accepted it with a fond smile. You're cute. He blew on the tea before taking a sip. I'm cute, Katsuki deadpanned. Yes. You're uffing nuts. Izuku patted the bed next to him. Sit. Katsuki hesitated before he acquiesced. You're still getting migraines, huh? Unfortunately. He smiled wryly. I haven't had one in a while. My doctor warned me that they might never fully go away. That sucks, Katsuki muttered. Izuku shrugged. He'd made peace with it months ago. Hopefully they'll become less frequent with time. He took a long sip of his tea, enjoying its warmth. You don't have to stay, he mumbled. I'll probably go back to bed once I'm done this. It's fine. I had the night set aside anyways. He smiled and leaned against Katsuki, his head resting on his shoulder. He had to admit that it felt nice to be doted on by someone who wasn't his mother. He inhaled the steam from his mug and closed his eyes. I meant it, by the way. Izuku cracked an eye open. Your project. You did a really good job with it. Katsuki released a long breath. It was inspiring and ish. You pulled all that together yourself. He grinned. I did. I had a lot of help, though. My friends gave me feedback and I paid a copy editor. Then there were all the people I interviewed. You. Katsuki raised an eyebrow. Me. Well, yeah. You were my starting point. He laughed quietly. Whether you meant to be or not. The anti-heroes inspired me. You pushed me in the right direction. Katsuki shook his head. I barely did it. This was all you. But. Deku. You worked hard, so stop trying to give away your accomplishments. Own them. Izuku closed his mouth. Fine, he said. But only because I don't feel like arguing with you. Katsuki reached over and ruffled his hair affectionately. Izuku took another sip of tea then lowered his mug. He was drowsy and Katsuki's shoulder was warm and comforting. He started to drift off. Distantly, Izuku felt Katsuki take the mug out of his hands. When he stood up, Izuku slumped sideways onto the bed. He rolled over so that he was facing the wall and dragged his pillow back over his head. Katsuki was capable of seeing himself out. He'd done it before. Seconds later, he felt the bed shift. Ka-chan, he asked, his voice muffled by the pillow. He felt Katsuki freeze. What? He paused. You're not going. Katsuki responded after a moment. Someone should keep an eye on you when you're all drugged up. I'm not that messed up. If you want me to go, I will. Izuku hesitated then reached out towards him. No, he said. Stay. He felt Katsuki relax. He kicked off his shoes then lay down next to him. Who's being difficult now, he grumbled. Izuku felt his heart skip a beat when Katsuki's chest brushed up against his back. Not me, he murmured. He patted Katsuki's leg. After a moment's hesitation, Katsuki put his hand on top of his and awkwardly wrapped their fingers together. A pleasant tingle traveled up Izuku's arm and into his chest. "Go to sleep, idiot," Katsuki whispered. Izuku responded by wriggling closer. Katsuki, for once, didn't pull away. Izuku's lips quirked beneath his pillow. He could definitely get used to this.